Okay, so let's go back and reset, right? This is chapter 2, and we're talking about epistemology. And the central question behind that word, epistemology is like shorthand for question, right? And the question behind epistemology is, how do we know what we know? Now, when we ask this question, how do we know what we know? As I mentioned earlier, the way you ask the question has a big impact on the kind of answers that you come up with. In philosophy, the way that you ask the question has a big impact on how you answer the question.
I need a hammer, not a spoon.
So we got to think about different ways of asking this question so we can come up with different ways of answering it, right? So if we think about the fact that what we know lots of different kinds of things, right? So when we think about the wide variety of the kinds of things that we as humans know, then we realize that there are lots of different hows, right? So we know different things and we know different things in different ways. One thing it might be good to do is think about pluralizing that word epistemology, right? And talk about epistemologies in the plural. Another way of asking it then may be, what are some of the different ways of knowing? And again, remembering that we know different things, right? There are different kinds of things that we know, and we know those different things in different ways. So that's what we're going to look at now. Usually referred to as the 4 epistemologies. We'll look at what those 4 are, but we can also call that into question. Maybe there's more than 4 different ways of knowing. Let me begin by giving a quick overview of what these ways of knowing are, and then we'll dive a little bit more deeply into some of these different ways. So one of the ways that we know are through dreams, right? So we dream, and how do we know our dreams? Well, we know using our imagination. That's a different thing than like actually experiencing something, being in the moment. Dreaming about ice cream, the ice cream dream, or remembering ice cream is very different than tasting ice cream, eating ice cream. We know things in a sensual way using our 5 senses, right? So tasting is different than reading about something. Hearing is different than reading about something, right? Being in the moment, experiencing things with our 5 senses is a different way of knowing. So there we've got 2 ways of knowing. One, imaginative, another one, sensual. But also rational knowledge, right? We can learn things from reading books. We can learn things from science. We can learn things from math. We can learn things from listening and talking to other people. We can learn things through words and through numbers. And so that we refer to as rational knowing. It's a different way of knowing than those other things. It's a way of knowing using our rational mind, which is different than our sensual bodies, right? They may not be totally separate from one another. They're not totally separate from one another, but they are distinct, right? It's very different to read about ice cream in a book than it is to taste ice cream, right? So there's 3 ways of knowing: imaginative, sensual, rational. And then the 4th way of knowing, at least according to Socrates, is what we call intellectual knowing. And we know different kinds of things intellectually. It's a different way of knowing than these other 3. It's more abstract. It's very abstract thinking. And so it becomes very difficult to describe what intellectual thinking or intellectual knowing is and how it's different from these other 3, but it is indeed different. And it's different primarily in the content of that knowing, right? So let's think about the various things that we know. So we can have rational knowledge of things. We can have sensual knowledge of things, which comes from that directly experiencing things, directly sensing things, using our 5 senses. That's where we got this word sensual, meaning those 5 senses. We can also dream.
Everyone dreams, I can dream too.
We have knowledge of our dreams, so that's a different way of knowing than these other kinds. What about memories?
Precious memories.
When we remember something, right, remembering the taste of ice cream is, again, different than tasting ice cream. We can also sometimes imagine things that we can't see, taste, touch, or smell, or feel, right? So we can imagine things using our creativity.
Can you imagine?
So imaginary things.
Together, we can imagine a better world.
Including especially things that we create, right? So this would be where our creativity comes in.
I'm creative, Ryan.
We're going to draw lines between these types of knowledge. I'm not going to draw a clear distinction between these They are different, but they're also in the same category. But then there's another category above rational knowledge that we're going to call ideas and forms, right? So we can have rational knowledge, but that's different than sort of abstract ideas and forms.
But Joy, this is abstract thought.
But this is on epistemology, so we're talking about the various ways of knowing, right? So these are the types of things that we know. So how do we know what we know? These are things that we know, right? These are the contents of our knowledge. But the question here in epistemology is, how do we know the various things that we know? So we have experience of sensual knowledge, sensual things, through sensual knowing.
Remember, use all your senses.
So sensual knowing involves our 5 senses, right? Seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, feeling, those sort of things, right? We also know these things using our imagination. So we'll call that imaginative knowing.
Use your imagination.
And then lastly, as you might have guessed, intellectual knowing.
She used her super intellect on me, man.
And of course, intellectual knowing is knowing using our intellect. And we'll talk more clearly about what we mean by that as we move forward, right? But for now, we're just trying to clarify the distinctions, right? To recognize that there are different ways of knowing and there are different contents for those various ways of knowing, right? All of this, by the way, this sort of schema, these 4 epistemologies, these 4 ways of knowing, these 4 types of knowledge or 4 kinds of knowledge comes from Socrates, as most of Western philosophy does. It comes from book 6 of the Republic, which was written by Plato, and Socrates is the star of that show. We'll look at book 7 of the Republic later on, primarily in chapter 8, when we get to the allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave comes directly after Socrates explains these 4 ways of knowing. And in fact, when we get there, we'll come back to these 4 ways of knowing, and we'll begin to see that the whole allegory of the cave is actually an allegory for, a way of understanding these different levels or ways of knowing, right? Those who are down in the cave are seeing images and imaginary things on the wall, which is different than sensing, right? Seeing, hearing, and tasting the real things in the world, which is different than rational knowing, and certainly different than the ideas and forms. And in the allegory of the cave, which we'll get to later, I'm just kind of giving you foreshadowing, kind of connecting some dots from now until where we will go later. Then he'll use ideas and forms. He'll use the image of the sun, right? So those people that are down in the cave or down here seeing these things, and the difference between these ways of knowing and these ways of knowing or contents of knowledge is as different as the shadows on the wall in the allegory of the cave and the sun in the sky, right? So pretty big difference between those ways of knowing. Now, about 1,800 years later, after Socrates gave us all of these things, Socrates gave it to us through Plato in the Allegory of the Cave in Book 6 of the Republic. Many centuries later, Nicholas of Cusa, mentioned him a few times before, it won't be the last time you hear about him. He revisited all of this, right? He revisited, certainly agreeing primarily with Plato, but also giving us a new perspective on things and really emphasizing the verbal aspect of knowing, right? Knowing is something that we do, right? It's a verb, right? So really emphasizing that knowing is a verb. Knowing is an activity. And like most verbs, right, there are different ways of doing something, right? I can run, but I can run slowly. I do run slowly. But I can run slowly, or I can run quickly, right? So we have different, or I can run haphazardly, or I can run chaotically, or I can run frantically. Lots of different ways of running. Likewise, there are different ways of knowing. So really emphasizing that knowing is a verb, knowing is an activity, an ongoing activity, and there are various adverbs that we could add to it, right? And so Cusa kind of takes all of this and he simplifies it. He says that we know imaginary things imaginatively. We know sensual things sensually. We know rational things rationally. We know intellectual things intellectually. All sounds pretty simple and obvious, right? But he also says there are also other ways of knowing besides these, right? And the main one that he adds in addition to these is what he calls spiritual knowing, right? So he says We know imaginary things imaginatively, sensual things sensually, rational things rationally, but we also know spiritual things spiritually, right? There's sometimes when we know something, we can't quite say why we know it. It's just something that we feel. There's something that, it seems like it comes to us through nature. It comes through us through the atmosphere. It comes to us through ways that we can't quite put our finger on, right? And so Nicholas of Cusa calls this spiritual knowing, right? But it's emphasis on the verbal aspect, right? So we know spiritual things spiritually. So it's a knowing that's in the moment, right? A way of knowing that is different than these other kinds. And we'll come back to that notion of spiritual knowing in the next chapter when we're studying phenomenology. Probably come back to it more than once. So let's give some examples. Let's try and make all of this a little bit more concrete. Why do we call it sensual knowledge? No? Yeah, because you know it through your five senses, right? So seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, right? So we know this through our five senses. Good. So is that pretty reliable? It's pretty reliable, right? If you see something with your eyes, tend to believe it. Hear something with your ears, you tend to at least know what you heard, right? Is it always? Is it 100%? No. Can you give an example?
Or
LSD.
True. Very true. Yep. Yeah. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Yep. Yeah. Sometimes you're expecting to see one thing because in this context, this makes sense, right? And then you see something and you're like, you just assume it's that thing that you're expecting, and then you look again and you're like, wait, it's not what I was expecting, right? I wasn't expecting that in this context. Yeah, really good.
I was not expecting that.
What defines sensual is that you know it with your five senses. What about rational? What defines rational? What defines rational knowledge? We've got that word ratio in there. So a ratio is always one thing to another, right? You need two things, right? You need some sort of a comparative relation to know one thing from another, right? To learn to... You need two things, right?
It's not the same thing.
It is the same thing.
So ratio is like, if I'm making breakfast, then I'll have like 1 part orange juice and 3 parts vodka, right? And that's just to get everything started, right? So you need like a ratio is a ratio of one thing to another. In Latin, this word ratio means ratio, but it also is the word for mind. Ratio and ratio is something that we know with our mind, but it's something that we know either in numbers. Here, I'll just write a definition. Rational knowledge is any knowledge that can be expressed in either words or numbers, or both. So anything that can be expressed in words and numbers would count as rational knowledge. If you can put a definition to it, if you can define it in the dictionary, everything in a dictionary is rational knowledge. Everything that you can get from mathematics is rational knowledge. Everything you can get from science is scientific, right, is rational knowledge. Rational knowledge is things that can be expressed in words and numbers. If it cannot be expressed in words or numbers, it's not rational knowledge. That does not mean it's irrational, right? Irrational is a different word. We'll deal with that later. But we just say rational versus non-rational, right? So if it's rational, then it can be expressed in words or numbers. Make sense, right? When you're learning something through, right? When you're learning those archetypes, and you point at something and you're like, Mommy, what's that?
What is that? What is that?
They answer you in words, usually, right? They say, this is a coffee cup, or this is a chihuahua, or this is whatever it is, right? They give you a name, and then you learn the name, the words, to associate with that thing that you're seeing with your eyes, right? So you see the dog with your eyes, and then that's sensual knowledge. You don't need anybody to tell you what you see, right? But then you need a name for it. So when you learn that name, then that's rational knowledge, right? And then that helps you distinguish between a dog and not a dog, right? Or a table and not a table. Rational knowledge is inherently binary. Rational knowledge is inherently binary. It's always a binary between whatever it is that you're talking about, right? And its opposite. The opposite of A is not A. The opposite of black is not black. The opposite of a dog is...
That's not a dog!
Not a dog. What's the whole point or goal of philosophy? Why do we do philosophy? What's the goal of philosophy? To help us make better decisions, right? And to make a decision is to make a what? To make a cut. To make a cut. To make a cut. Make a decision. Like incision, right? Incision is to cut something in. Scissors are what you cut with, right? Decision is just to make a cut, right? So if you're at a crossroads, right, you've got two possibilities. Am I going to choose this or not, right? So to make a decision is to choose that or not that, right? Have you ever had, this happens, I mean, as a dad all the time. Has somebody ever looked at you and said, like,
Why did you choose that?
I mean, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you do it this way? Like, why'd you do it that way? Why didn't you do it this other way? Right?
Why did you do that?
Make you feel dumb sometimes. People are like,
Why did you do that?
where somebody says, like, why didn't you do it this other way? That's so much more easy than the way you did it. And usually your answer is what? Yeah, didn't think of it, right? You can't choose an option if you don't think about it, right?
Why didn't I think of that?
So it only becomes an option if you think about it. So there's like the option that you're thinking about versus not that option. And so the answer is, why didn't I think of it? Why didn't you do this? It's like, well, I didn't think about doing it that way, right? So that option, yes, it was a possibility. Yes, it was an option, but I didn't think about doing it that way, right? So that wasn't in my head. If you wish to reach a good decision on any topic, my boy, there is only one way to begin. You must first know what the decision is about. Otherwise, you're bound to miss your target altogether, right? So to make a decision, you have a decision is always between one thing and not doing that thing. And computers are extremely good at rational knowledge. They're way better than us at this. Way better at this than us, right? Right? Way better than us at this. So a computer is good at sort of like knowing the options and discerning between the options. What does binary language look like in computer? Like when we talk about binary language, what do we mean by that? Zeros and ones, right? It's always either here we'll let A equals 1 and not A equal 0, right? In computer speech, 1 means on, 0 means off, or yes, right, and no. Pretty simple, right? So it's either 1 or 0. It's either on or it's off. It's either yes or no, right? That's just how a computer doesn't think, right? A computer calculates, and that's how it makes its calculations. It's binary between this or that. Kind of skipped imaginative, but that's okay. This feels right. Imaginative knowing, these are definitions, right? So dreams count.
Dream, 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 dream.
Memories, I can remember what ice cream tastes like I said a minute ago, right? But that's still different than sensual knowing. It's certainly different than reading about ice cream. When we use the phrase artificial intelligence,
AI means artificial intelligence.
what does that mean?
And artificial intelligence means robots.
We've got this word, intellect, right, in here, which is not totally different than the word intelligence.
Artificial intelligence.
Right, so what is an artificial intellect or an artificial intelligence? Yeah.
Artificial intelligence.
So you start it up and then it goes on its own kind of thing? Yeah, good.
An artificial computer intelligence.
Isn't that what it is? I think that's a really good way of saying, that's how I think about it, right? Is that the difference, every computer does this. This is what a computer does, right? Is A, not A. You tell it, if this is the case, then choose this. If this is not the case, don't choose this, right? That's just basic programming. But artificial intelligence is able to make the decision itself, right? So then you're programming it, like Austin's saying, and saying, when you get to this situation, then you have to make a decision, right? And how do you know if a computer is like making a decision or just doing what it's programmed, deciding what it's programmed to decide in a particular place, right? No easy answer to that. We're not going to solve that one right now, but at least you get the point, right, of the difference between intellect. What is the intellect? How have we defined intellect up till now? Intellect is the part of the human person that does what? Well, not quite. I mean, it thinks, true, but it's something more specific. Yeah, that's right. The intellect is the part of the human person that makes decisions, right? So intellectual knowing is part of that, making decisions. But what about these ideas? Things that fall under the category of ideas and forms are things that are abstract, things that are beyond words. Abstract noun is generally, it usually ends in the letters NESS, right? So like teamness or goodness or happiness, those sort of things, right? They're abstract nouns. I can be happy. I know what it feels like when I am happy. Probably give a rational account of what the word happy means, but that's certainly different than being happy. But happiness is something more abstract. And philosophy is primarily interested in these, or primarily focused on these very abstract things that we'll call ideas and forms. And so part of the point of organizing our thought patterns into these 4 epistemologies primarily is just to know it, right? So that we can be clear when we're using our language, when we're talking about anything, right? That just about anything should be able to fit in one of these categories. And we want to be careful to kind of keep the lines clear when we're communicating with another person. What are we talking about? Are we talking about dreams? Are we talking about memories? Are we talking imaginative knowing? Are we talking about things that we've seen, smelled, heard, touched, right, directly? A sort of direct experience through using our 5 senses? Are we talking about things that other people have told us? Are we talking about things that we've read in a book? Are we talking about things that we can measure or describe and using words and numbers? Or are we talking about more abstract ideas and forms,
But Joy, this is abstract thought.
And the ideas and forms that are going to occupy our attention most in this course are things like truth, justice, equality, and beauty. None of those actually end in the word ness. Not all abstract nouns end in NESS.
There are 4 stages. This is the first. Non-objective fragmentation.
But most do. We can take most words and then abstract them using...
In the second stage, we're deconstructing.
But some words don't need it, right? Justice, we don't have justice-ness. We just have justice. Justice is already an abstract noun.
Oh no, we're 2-dimensional. That's stage 3.
Equality is already something abstract. Beauty is something abstract, right? So...
Oh no, we're not figurative. This is the last stage.
These are these primary forms: justice, equality, beauty, goodness. That's one of those abstract nouns that has a NES at the end, that are going to occupy your attention a lot. Okay, now one other thing I want to mention, which is a key reason why I bring up Nicholas of Cusa, and a key way that he's different than Socrates. One could get the idea from reading Plato's Republic that not only are there 4 different ways of knowing, but because Socrates teaches this in the context of his allegory of the cave, which he clearly prefers, right, that we get liberated and emerge out of the cave so that we can have these sort of intellectual knowing, these experiences or intellectual knowledge of justice, truth, beauty, and those sort of ideas and forms, one could get the idea that there's a clear hierarchy or preference for this way of knowing versus these other ways of knowing. And I think for Socrates that might be true. But Nicholas of Cusa points out that, these are just different ways of knowing, and we shouldn't prioritize and say that intellectual knowing is better than sensual knowing, because in our actual experience, right, it's better to sense, to actually live in a world that's filled with beauty and justice and harmony and equality than it is to have philosophical discourse about them. Even if we understand them intellectually, it's still very different to understand it intellectually than it is to actually live in a world that's filled with justice and those sort of things, right? So it's one thing to have an understanding of beauty, it's another thing to see it. So I think that's enough for this section. Just to recap, right, we're talking about epistemology. Central question behind epistemology is that question, how do we know what we know? And here we're asking that question with an emphasis on how do we know what we know, recognizing that the different things that we know in different ways, right? And primarily in these 4 or 5 different ways, right? We know imaginative things imaginatively, using our, through dreams and memories, imagination, creativity, that sort of things, right? We know sensual things using our 5 senses, so seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, feeling, hearing. We know rational things rationally, right? Using our rational mind. We'll come to that a lot more in chapter 6. We know spiritual things spiritually, right? Something more intangible than any of these other ways. And intellectually, we know ideas and forms intellectually. So when I use that word epistemology, the question should come to mind, how do we know what we know? And when I use the phrase 4 epistemologies or various ways of knowing, then this is the framework that we're talking about, right? Which originally comes back to Socrates and Plato and the Republic, but also gets transformed and understood in different ways by different philosophers. And I invite you to understand it and explore it in your own way.
Break time! Break time!
When I was little, my brother stole everything. He would come and steal all my shoes, and he would just break everything. And so I developed this spray. It's called Bannon Brothers spray. It has no casualties. You just go, see, and then they'll run away immediately. And are you kidding me? All dirty now. What are you doing? Get away! See, it works like a charm. Only problem is you can run out quickly. But then you can just come back. Bannon Brothers spray. Now $5. Boom! If you have little brother problems, you can come to my store and buy Bannon Brothers spray.
So next, I want to approach this question again of epistemology, right? The central question of epistemology is how do we know what we know? But let's come at it from a different direction, right? And not just from a different direction, but actually from a different history of thinking, a whole different philosophical approach. What we've mostly been doing up to this point is studying the Western way of approaching this question of epistemology, but the Greeks aren't the only philosophers in the world, right? And so let's see how Indian philosophy and Indian philosophers approach this question of how do we know what we know. Okay, so now we're going to come back to this question, how do we know what we know? But ask it the way that Indian philosophers have asked it for thousands of years. And in the same way that we went back to the Greek tradition and looked at the Greek text, we'll start looking at the Sanskritic tradition, right? So how has this question been asked among thinkers in Sanskrit? And if we were to ask the same question from this perspective, then we might put more emphasis on this. How do we know what we know, right? How can we be certain that the knowledge, the things that we think we know, what degree of certainty can we have? And in Indian philosophy, it's recognized that, well, we can never be 100% certain of anything that we know. So let's sort of think clearly about the various sources of knowledge. We know what we know from various different sources. And so from an Indian philosophical perspective, Indian philosophers ask, well, what is the source of that knowledge and how valid is that knowledge and how certain are we that we're understanding it or perceiving it in the right way? So the Indian philosophical tradition is huge, right? I mean, there's millions of philosophers over thousands of years that have asked these questions. So I'm going to narrow our focus in the same way that we did in the Western tradition, focusing more on Socrates and that Greek tradition, which isn't the only Western tradition. We're going to narrow similarly in the Indian philosophical tradition. And we're going to focus on primarily on this guy named Shabda. Shabda was a Mimamsika. Now our dates on Shabda aren't 100% certain. He's from the early centuries of the Common Era, right? 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, somewhere around there. And the ideas I'm going to give you now don't necessarily come directly from Shabda. He's part of a longer tradition, and he's a great thinker within that tradition. But in the Indian tradition, what we call in the West epistemology is usually referred to as the PramAnas. So PramAna theory. So the word PramAna is usually translated or defined as a valid source of knowledge. And Shabda and his tradition give these valid sources of knowledge in a particular hierarchy of trustworthiness. So we can know things from various sources. Some of those sources are more reliable or trustworthy than others, right? But Shabda would emphasize none of them is going to be 100%. We can always make mistakes, as we'll see in the very first one. So the first valid source of knowledge, or the first PramAna that Shabda gives us, is Pratyaksa. So the word Pratyaksa actually literally means that which is in front of our eyes, that which is right before our eyes, right? So direct perception, direct sensual perception, right? So directly seeing right in front of our eyes, right? So that, Shabda says, is the most trustworthy, right? If you see it, it's right before your eyes. If you touch it, if you hear it, if you smell it, right, then that's going to be more reliable than if somebody tells you it's there, right? If somebody tells you, if you see something and somebody says that's not there, you're going to be like, no, I'm going to trust my eyes more than what I'm being told from this other person. Right, so Pratyaksa is the most reliable or most valid source of knowledge, that direct sensual perception. Now you would say maybe this comes close to being 100%, but as Shabda points out, right, it's not. Sometimes we see something, we think we see something, but then it turns out that maybe we didn't actually see what we saw, right? So he says, use this example, like what if you're walking on the beach, you know, and you see something shiny on the beach and you think, oh, there's like a piece of silver there. But you run up and it's just a shell, right? It's just a seashell glistening that looks like something else. But so you thought you saw one thing. Another common example that we'll maybe look at later in the semester is, suppose, you know, it's like late at night, I'm going out to the barn, you know, to like feed the horse or something like that. And I'm barefoot, you know, and I go out to the barn, and I look down on the ground and I see a snake, right? And I jump back because I like almost stepped on the snake, and the snakes are scary, right? And so if you see something on the ground and you think it's a snake and you jump back, then what you saw was a snake, right? So that was right before your eyes. But then you take a look back and maybe you shine a light on it and you see actually it's just a rope, or it's just a garden hose or something that was there, right? So direct perception is very reliable, but can sometimes be mistaken. And it's more likely to be mistaken if the conditions aren't exactly right, right? If it's kind of dark.
We shouldn't be out here in the dark.
Then you can't see things clearly. If you're very, very tired.
I'm just so tired.
You can't see things clearly. If you're intoxicated or in an altered state of mind, then, you know, your eyes are more likely to deceive you. But nevertheless, Pratyaksa is a pretty reliable, the most reliable source of knowledge, right? So if you see it, if you taste it, if you hear it, then it's hard for anybody to convince you then what you're seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, feeling isn't actually the case, right? Which brings us to the second source of valid knowledge, AnumAna. AnumAna is usually translated as inference. So AnumAna is logical or rational inference, right? So one of the common examples here is, let's say you're at a distance, right, and you see some smoke going up in the sky, right? So you can't see a fire there, but you see smoke. So your direct perception is of smoke. But because you know
Where there's smoke, there's a fire.
that wherever there's smoke, there must be fire, because smoke comes from fire, then you can infer that there's fire there, right? So you're not seeing the fire, you're seeing the smoke. So your direct perception is telling you there's smoke over there, and then you can infer that there's fire there, right? Maybe you're mistaken. It could be water vapor.
Oh, that isn't smoke. It's steam.
It could be something else, right? It could be a foggy or cloud, or it could be something that's not actually smoke.
Ionized gas, water vapor.
But if you're actually seeing smoke, then you can infer with a great deal of confidence that your knowledge that there is a fire there is valid. The word AnumAna is interesting in and of itself, because mana is thinking and anu means after, right? So it's a kind of thinking that comes after. After what? Well, after Pratyaksa, right? So you see something and then you infer based on that after the fact, right? So you see smoke, and then after seeing smoke, then you infer that there's fire, right? So again, this is pretty reliable. It's reliable as long as you understand logic and reason, so you can see why it's second. The third is Shabda. Now Shabda literally means words.
Word?
Word.
Shabda literally means word, but it's often translated as testimony. So the word or the testimony that comes from somebody else, right? So obviously not all words or testimony is going to be valid, right? So then here, the source of that, some words are going to be more trustworthy than others, and it depends then on where those words coming from, right? If they're coming from an advertisement, not very reliable, right? If they're coming from a parent or a teacher or a caregiver or somebody who cares about you, then it's very unlikely that they're trying to deceive you. Then you can count that word or testimony from that trustworthy person as more or less valid, right? Now, people still make mistakes. They could have misunderstood something. They could have misperceived something, or circumstances could have changed between when they saw what they're telling you, right? Maybe they got things wrong or whatever. It's not as valid as these other sources of knowledge. Now, for Shabda, when he said Shabda, what he really meant was the scriptures, right? So he's talking about the Vedas. So the Vedas are the most trustworthy testimony and most trustworthy word. So that wisdom that's been passed down over thousands and thousands of years, even by Shabda's time, it was already been passed down for 3,000 years before him, right? So that testimony that's been passed down over millennia, and the Shabda that he's talking about is, that wisdom about truth and justice, and what does it mean to be a good person, and how do you live an ethical life, and what are the right things to do and what are the wrong things to do. So those kind of things, that sort of wisdom that is passed down over millennia and passed down through reliable sources, which for Shabda was the Vedas, right? So that is the valid source of knowledge. Now, one of the things that is pointed out, right, is that even if the Shabda said 1,000 times over that fire isn't hot, that doesn't make it so, right? But even if the scripture did say fire is cold, it doesn't change the fact that fire is hot, right? So if you were directly perceived, you were to touch the fire, it would be hot. So that's why it falls under these other categories. So the next PramAna, or valid source of knowledge, is UpamAna. And UpamAna is usually translated as sort of an analogy or comparison. So analogy or metaphor would probably work better, right? So if someone's trying to explain something to you, right, that they're trying to tell you about something that you've never seen before, right? So if you've never seen it before, then how can you know what it is, right? So they're trying to explain something to you about something maybe from a distant land, right? So they're a traveler from somewhere else, and they go somewhere else. They see some amazing things, and they come back and they're trying to tell you, I saw giraffes, and you've never seen a giraffe before, right? And this was an age where you didn't have Google, so you couldn't just look up and show somebody a picture of a giraffe or something like that, right? So how would you explain what a giraffe is to somebody who's never seen a picture of a giraffe and has no idea what a giraffe is? Well, you might start by saying, well, it's kind of like a cow, right? So, it's like a cow or like a horse, right? But it's different than a cow, and it's different than a horse because, it has this long neck, So we can start by something familiar. And here we might draw some comparison to what we talked about in the previous section with Nicholas of Cusa and comparative relation, right? So you're drawing a comparison to something that they've seen before, like you've seen this archetype before, and I'm telling you about something that's different than that, but still in that same vein, right? So drawing a comparison or analogy. So obviously, your understanding of the thing that they're trying to explain to you, you'll have a better understanding of it after they give that analogy, because you're like, okay, I've seen a horse, so if I imagine a horse with a long neck, then you're probably in your mind going to have an image of a horse with a long neck, which isn't exactly what a giraffe is, right? But it's gonna be better. It's going to be a more valid source of knowledge than if you didn't have it, right? And philosophy, in fact, uses analogy, metaphor, imagery a lot, right? Already in this course, already in this video book, we've already talked about the allegory of the chariot, right? And the allegory of the chariots as an allegory or as a analogy is going to be running through this entire, philosophical quest. And so it's helpful to recognize where it falls in to this hierarchy of valid sources of knowledge. Now, I want to give you one more. Almost nobody would give a list of 5 with AbhAva as the 5th one. There are other PramAnas that we don't need to concern ourselves with for this introductory level course, right? But I do want to talk about AbhAva because it is a very unique, valid source of knowledge. It's one that's more controversial, even among Indian thinkers and Indian philosophers. Some philosophers, the ones that I have focused most of my attention on as a scholar, emphasize that AbhAva stands on its own. It deserves to be treated as a valid source of knowledge separate than these others. That is a distinct way of knowing. The same way that analogy is very different than, logical inference, or it's very different than these others, right? Likewise, AbhAva is a different valid source of knowledge than the others. So what is it about AbhAva? What is AbhAva? Well, first, let's start with what does the word mean? Meaning not, and bhava meaning being. So not being, absence or non-being. How could absence or non-being be a valid source of knowledge? Right. This is a topic that a lot of Indian philosophers debate with one another. Like, how could that be a valid source of knowledge? How can the non-being of something be a source of knowing anything? Right? Because it's not there. There's this other philosopher that comes after Shabda, a few centuries after Shabda. His name is Cumarla Bhatta. Now, Cumarla Bhatta was a fantastic philosopher, one of the great philosophers of India, and especially within this Mimamsaka tradition that Shabda is a part of. And I've read a number of things by Cumarla Bhatta, and I read his explanation, his defense of AbhAva as a PramAna, and found it incredibly insightful. So insightful that I've shared it with classes, throughout time. And I think that it reveals something to us that the other PramAnas don't. And Cumarla Bhatta explains it very well. And so I want to give the explanation that Cumarla Bhatta has given in this short period of time that I can. I want to emphasize that, as Cumarla Bhatta does, that AbhAva is a valid source of knowledge that teaches us something that we can't learn from the other valid sources of knowledge, right? So that's the defense of why it stands on its own, of why it is different than these others. It's not logical inference. It's different than these others because it teaches us something that we can't know from the other valid sources of knowledge. And the thing that it teaches us, as Cumarla Bhatta points out, is the relationship between cause and effect. So how do we know that something is the cause of something else? Right? That's the question. How do we know, right? So valid source of knowledge. So the knowledge that we're seeking in this case is the knowledge of the relationship between cause and effect. So how do we know that something is the cause of something else, right? And the example that Cumarla Bhatta gives is maybe foreign to you if you have no experience with this. As somebody who has a cow and who lives on a farm and who makes yogurt, this is an analogy that makes, this is an explanation that makes a lot of sense to me. As Cumarla Bhatta explains, right? Say you've got a bowl of milk.
Bowl of milk?
Right? Day one, you milk the cow.
Milk?
Put the milk in a bowl.
I could put it in a bowl.
And then you just leave it there, right? So you've got milk in a bowl. Now you know that you've got milk in a bowl because you can directly see it, right? You look in the bowl, there's milk there. You directly perceive milk. Milk is in the bowl, right? You know that milk's in the bowl because you can see it. You could taste it, you could smell it.
And he smelled like whole milk.
You can touch it, right? You can have direct experience of the milk that's in the bowl, right? So that's Pratyaksa. That's valid source of knowledge number 1. That's the most reliable. But then you come back tomorrow, right? You come back later, or maybe you stand there, maybe you're diligent and you stand there and you just wait.
Examining the milk, delving into milk, consumed with milk.
Right? And you make sure that nobody else comes and nobody else messes with the bowl or anything like that. And you wait and you come back a day, usually a day is enough, but you come back a day or so later and you look in that same bowl where the milk was and you see that there's no more milk there. Right? There's a bowl that had milk in it, but now there's no milk. And how do you know there's no milk? Well, because you directly perceive yogurt, right? You look in the bowl and you see curd.
Curds.
Right? The milk has turned into curd.
It can make curds and whey.
Right? So you could say, well, I know that the milk is the cause of the curd because I see the curd, right? But Cumarla Bhatta is pointing out that you know that the milk is the cause of the curd because you see the non-being of the milk, right? Now here's something super worth knowing, I think. Super insightful, super interesting. See if you can follow me here, because the philosophy is deep. And why this is so unique, why this is such a unique example.
You have my undivided attention.
So you come one day and you directly perceive milk. You come back the next day and you directly perceive curd in the same bowl. That, in and of itself, AbhAva says, is not sufficient to tell us that the milk is the cause of the curd. Now here's the super interesting, deep philosophical point. Right? Super important point. And the reason that AbhAva is such an important pramana. He says when you are perceiving the curd, in addition to perceiving the curd, you're also perceiving the absence or the non-being, the AbhAva of the milk, right? So you're perceiving the curd, but you're also perceiving the non-being of the milk, right? And here's the super interesting part, right? Because AbhAva's point, to a large extent, is that the milk only becomes the cause of the curd at the very moment that the milk no longer exists. Let me say that again. The milk only becomes the cause of the curd at the very moment that the milk ceases to exist. Right? So what you're seeing is the curd, using a direct perception. What you saw before was the milk, but the milk only becomes the cause of the effect at the moment that the cause ceases to exist. Right? So it only becomes a cause when it stops existing, right? So the non-existence of the milk is how we know that the milk is the cause of the curd, right? This, I think, teaches us something really profound and really different and really interesting about the relationship between cause and effect, at least when we're talking about material cause and material effect, right? So the cause, when we talk about this causes that, right? So the milk is the cause, the curd is the effect. But the milk isn't the cause when it's milk. When it's milk, it's milk. It's not the cause of yogurt, right? It only becomes the cause of yogurt at the very moment that it stops existing, right? So AbhAva, non-being, right? So you perceive its non-existence, and that's how you know it is the cause, because it only became the cause at the moment it ceased to exist.
My mind is literally blown right now.
I hope you find that as profound as I do. So one more time. The milk only becomes the cause of the curd at the very moment that the milk ceases to exist. So when we perceive the effect, right? We perceive the curd.
Birds and way.
So we know that there's curd there because we directly perceive it. So it's not, right? So we perceive the curd. We know curd is there. We know the curd exists because we directly perceive it. That's not pramana number one. Yesterday we directly perceived the milk. But we only understand this relationship between cause and effect when we recognize that the milk had to cease existing in order for the curd to exist. Right? So the creator, or the cause in this case, right, only becomes the cause at the moment that it ceases to exist. So, what's our main takeaway? Our main takeaway from this, right, going back, the central question of epistemology, how do we know what we know? In Indian philosophy, they're approaching this question, how do we know what we know, from a different perspective than we've seen so far in this Greek Western tradition, right? So how do we know what we know? So how can we prioritize certainty, right? What sources of knowledge are more valid or more trustworthy or more reliable than others, right? We see direct perception is the most reliable, but it can also be faulty, right? Shabda also emphasizes the direct sensual perception is not faulty at all, it's infallible. What's fallible is humans, right? So he points out that that perception is a process, right? So we may see a rope and think that it's a snake, but that's not because perception it's faulty, that's because the conditions weren't quite right for perception, right? Maybe I was tired, or maybe it was dark outside, or maybe I had seen a snake there the day before, or whatever, right? So there are other conditions, other factors that come in to sort of like disrupt or intervene in perception. So perception itself is super reliable, but sometimes if the conditions aren't right, then we may not actually perceive what's there. So we may misperceive what is there. But how do we trust knowledge, or how do we know if our knowledge is valid if we didn't directly perceive it ourselves? Well, Indian philosophers give us a process, right, for understanding how to meet things out, right? How to sort things out and know what sort of sources are more valid than others. But hopefully another important takeaway is that these PramAnas actually teach us different things, right? There are things that we can know through analogy that we couldn't know from other sources of knowledge. There are things that we can learn through AbhAva that we couldn't know from other valid sources of knowledge. There are certainly things that we can learn, wisdom that's passed down from those who lived lives before us, who've been passing this wisdom down over centuries or millennia, that we just couldn't know without that source, right? So these are valid sources of knowledge, and one of the things that all these Indian philosophers emphasize is that they should never be contradicting one another, right? They are distinct, valid sources of knowledge, and if they're in contradiction with one another, then there's a problem with how we're interpreting or how we're understanding them, right? It's not a problem with the sources themselves. I think that's more than enough.